Deck builders are a reasonably new genre of video game, and it's a great name for a genre because it's kind of self-explanatory what the player is going to be doing. You have a deck of cards and you add stuff to it gradually to build a better deck of cards. Better for what though? Well, that's the part that depends on the individual game. Now, given that video games and indie games in particular are very prone to having impenetrable genre titles like Metroidvania or roguelike, it's refreshing to get a genre which does just what it says on the tin. In this video, I'm going to talk about some key games from the history of the genre, some more recent video game deck builders, and then, because this is a channel devoted to helping people think like game designers, I'm going to talk about how different games use deck building to different ends. I like to make sure that I practice what I preach, so instead of just analysing and criticising existing games, today I've got a little bit of an experiment. I'm going to try and design the world's first meta deck builder where I can just bring in cards from all sorts of different games and put them in the same game, and it's going to be great. Kind of similar to what the NFT guys were going for with interoperability of items, where you could get, a sword in Skyrim and then you could load up a Grand Prix racing game and you could use your sword from Skyrim in that, and it would be good. Dominion. Dominion is often thought of as the crusty old grandparent of the genre. Players take the role of feudal lords who are vying for, that's right, dominion of a place. You'll spend your turns taking actions based on the cards in your hand and buying cards from a central market. Now, while the theming of this game might not seem super exciting, it did introduce a lot of genre elements which are still present in games like Slay the Spire and Roguebook. The larger a deck, the less likely you are to draw a specific card, and you're even less likely to draw a specific combination. And so the top level problem in Dominion and most games after it lies in attempting to create synergistic combinations of cards without bloating your deck so much that you never draw the two cards you want together. That's a card from Slay the Spire. You probably already know that game if you're watching this video. It's one of the most famous indie video game deck builders out there. And then we've got a strike card from Roguebook. I guess that's going to be useful whatever game you're playing. You're always going to want to attack something for 7 unless you're playing some kind of ridiculous game that isn't about violence. In Dominion, you have to buy these green victory point cards to win, which are meant to be provinces and other different sized chunks of land, and you don't want to invest in them too early because they're useless when drawn and slow your gameplay down. So I kind of like to think of that as being a representation of how a bigger kingdom involves more admin. What am I going to get next? I've got a rock star. Oh, that's from Party House, which is a deck builder in the UFO 50 collection. I've got a gold. I suppose that's useful. I can use that in any game. I could see how the rock star and the gold might go together. Maybe you strike a rock star to get gold. Dominion, like a lot of tabletop games in the European tradition, involves relatively little direct player conflict and is more about racing to do things first, occasionally blocking other players by taking the thing that they wanted. I really love Dominion and I'll always play around with it when I'm offered, but I can't help but think that these digital implementations are a bit clunky and make it hard to work out what's going on, particularly when it comes to your opponents and what they're doing. I know I'm playing someone called Medium Al here, but his turns whiz past and I don't really have a sense of what his strategy is like I might have if I was sat at a table with them and they're talking about what they're doing. Sorry, Medium Owl, it's just not the same without a real person. Star Realms. Now, if peasants and pastoral countryside don't do it for you, there are some games in this genre which are more focused on going zap, pow, pew pew pew, etc. Star Realms blends the basic mechanics of Dominion with the head-to-head dueling of something like Magic the Gathering, Yu-Gi-Oh! Or the Pokemon TCG. In Star Realms, you have 3 main currencies. One is basically your hit points, and then each turn you'll generate trade and attack. Trade lets you buy cards, and attack usually is for damaging your opponent, but occasionally you might need to use it to take out their pesky space stations, because nothing says intergalactic warlord like using a moon-sized colony as your own personal human shield. Just like Dominion, there's a reasonably good digital version of this on Steam, but because I was only playing the demo, I was forced to play against Medium Owl again, even though he beat me at Dominion 3 times in a row. Ascension. Now, Ascension has a sort of fantasy battling theme, but the players don't attack each other directly. Instead, when the market has red monster cards in it, you can use your red attacky points to do them a hurty boo-boo on their noggin. This will get you some stars, which contribute to you winning the game, amongst other things. If you like the cute but weird aspects of Slay the Spire's art and world building, or you're just really into 90s psychedelic throwback style, this might be the game for you, because as you can see, most of the illustration looks like it was done by a lady who sells dream catchers and t-shirts with a wolf on. Most deck builders have you draw 5 cards a turn. That's the usual hand size, so we're gonna go with that this time and see if it's still interoperable when I do that. A Ravenous Gorp. When this enters the center row, banish all cards adjacent to it. So my game doesn't even have a center row yet. So to make my meta deck builder truly interoperable, I'm going to have a center row of cards here. So, you know, as a designer, I need to decide what's more important. Keeping the Ravenous Gorp in there, or going for simpler stuff that doesn't mean I need to pick a center row of cards. Maybe I'll just put all of these cards in the center and they can be the center row for now, although I'll be sad to lose my Rockstar. A lot of these digital versions that I've been playing feel quite clunky, and I usually get the impression that they were designed mainly for people who have already learned to play via the tabletop version of the game. For example, look at this screen in Ascension, which expects me to know all of these acronyms for different expansion sets. What do you think I am, some kind of nerd? I find it quite hard when playing one of these to really pay any sort of attention to what my opponents are doing, and while that's kind of normal in these kind of low interaction card games, it does show how much wasted effort is going into modelling AI players who may as well just be a HP stat or some randomly going up number for me to race against each turn. A lot of these implementations also just don't have key features I've come to expect from digital card games like Hearthstone, like for example showing helper text on common keywords when you mouse over them. There are lots of little highlights to show me which moves are valid, but there's not enough information there to contextually teach me why those moves are valid, and to be honest, I kind of hate it. I think the digital implementations are hard to get your head around if you've never played the game with actual cards before. Before we move on to talking about deck building in video games, there are a couple of other examples of games where deck building started to become one element in something larger. Clank is a great example of this, where the players are rogues and their cards represent moves, treasures and other resources they might collect as they attempt to carry out a heist in a dragon's lair. Here the cards are used to move around on and interact with elements of a board, including a negative resource called Clank, which basically amounts to a measure of how much noise you're making and how much chance there is that the big old nasty dragon is going to burn you on the bottom. What else is in the meta deck builder deck? Let's have a look. Aquina, the daughter that you have trouble remembering. When an enemy attacks you, exhaust Aquina and deal 1 horror to her. Don't really want to do that. She's from Arkham Horror. You can see she's got 1 heart and 4 brains. That's going to be important knowledge to have access to later on. This one's a little bit grainy, but I think that says Guernsey. It's a cow. It's a white cow, presumably because it produces milk, and it's got a little badge on here that I think sort of suggests it might be involved in law enforcement. It does mean that it might not synergize very well with the Rockstar, because they famously don't get on with police. Great Western Trail is a really heavy economic sim about cowboys doing cowboy stuff. You have a deck representing your herd of cows. You can add stuff to it and it improves, but you only really use it every few turns to determine some rewards. It's no longer the core of the game really at this point. About the same time we get Arkham Horror in 2016 and the later Pathfinder adventure card game in 2019, which both see the players using decks of cards to represent player abilities, which tend to only be modified between adventures. And this is an interesting adaptation to note because this is the format that we tend to see most modern digital deck builders take. Slay the Spire. Whether or not it's the first video game of its type, it's certainly one of the best known. Slay the Spire is still probably my favourite game in this genre, and that's despite it having really weird world building and art that is not really to my taste. It always reminded me a little bit of Adventure Time with all of the cute stripped out of it until what remains is just kind of weird and gross. But Slay the Spire is a bit of a masterclass in how to design a game of this nature. You start with just one of the classes unlocked, and it takes a lot of slow progression to unlock the other classes and to earn the more complicated cards for each class. But this is very well paced in terms of allowing you to learn the game slowly without being overwhelmed by too much content at once. You'll probably still be unlocking cards and characters by the time you survive a run to the end. This is one of those games that I've bought on multiple platforms and I always end up coming back to because it's just so good. Although I don't really vibe with the art and the world building, I think the strange alienness of it does serve the game because very rarely are you relying on tropes of what it normally means to be a warrior or a mage or a rogue in a fantasy setting, because all of the monster designs, the classes, do not really map directly onto tropes that we can recognize. And while that might be a bad thing in some types of game, I think it really helps with how Slay the Spire feels to get to grips with as you play it for the first 10 or so hours. But Slay the Spire does deviate quite a lot from the deck builders I described earlier because, well, you're not really building your deck during the combat gameplay, which is what takes up most of the playtime. You're not playing cards against an enemy AI that is also playing cards. They just have sets of moves like enemies in an old turn-based JRPG. And here the deck building becomes less of what you're doing moment to moment and is more akin to putting a point in a skill tree in a game like Diablo. It's still a game about building a deck of cards, but the building of the deck is moved from the core moment to moment gameplay into being part of the player's slower progression in leveling up their character. Now, I'm not saying any of that to be a genre purist and say, oh, they're getting deck builders wrong. It's more about observing the differences and how a system like deck building can be used differently in different game contexts to achieve different things. In Dominion, I'm buying new cards every turn because I'm supposed to be a lord, so buying the resources and developing an economy to let me buy them is a more central part of the game and what the game is modelling. Slay the Spire is perhaps more close to Clank because the cards represent stuff my character can physically do. But here, the manipulation of my deck during the actual combat is quite minimal, and although I might get things like debuffs or buffs shuffled in, those tend to be temporary and go away at the end of a battle. Kiss Neck. Now, I got this card from a little game called Clientele, which is a sexy deck builder, it says. And I was going to include it in this video, but I thought I might get demonetized because there's a lot of nudity in that game. But the designer here has effectively thought, what would it be like if we used Deck Builder to explain what it's like to be a man who kisses ladies for money? I think it's quite an interesting premise. I'd like to see it explored more, but there's just something a little bit lackluster about the design of this card when you compare it to some of the others. So it's going to stay in here to show you the full breadth of what deck builders can do as a genre, but I can't really see how it synergizes with a lot of these cards. If I was going to use Kiss Neck with any of these other cards, you know, I might kiss her on the neck, I might kiss him on the neck, maybe, or maybe one of these would kiss the other one on the neck, but I'm not sure I'd want to kiss a Guernsey cow or a ravenous Gorf on the neck. I don't think he even has one. Hearthstone Dungeon Run and Duels. Not an indie game, but worth mentioning here nonetheless. Hearthstone actually experimented with a similar format several times. Dungeon Run mode released the same year as Slay the Spire and saw players starting with a small deck of cards and then adding packs of 3 to it after each boss. Later on, this was developed into the multiplayer versus mode called Duels, which I personally loved and was my favourite thing in the game until Blizzard removed it earlier this year because they wanted to make me cry. Taverns of Tiefenthal. Back to another non-digital game. Taverns of Tiefenthal is another game where deck building is used as one mechanic in a bigger set. It's not the only thing you're doing. Here the deck represents a player's customer base and they're able to draw more of those customers each opening night depending on how many chairs and tables they've bought, which is one of a many number of things about their tavern that they have to think about and invest resources in. Roguebook. Now, Roguebook takes a lot of the elements which make Slay the Spire work and innovates with an open world map, 2-player characters to manage resources and positioning for, and art which doesn't make me feel sick. I really love this one, but the higher level of polish seems to have had a trade-off in terms of the whole game feeling a bit smaller and with less to discover and do. I really love the fact that there are 2 characters here and you're sort of shuffling the position of them both to work out who is in the defensive role, and the deck is like a combination of the 2 things they can do, and that's really where Roguebook gets its replayability from, because you can play these different characters together and see how they combo and see how different strategies for different characters fit together. Hellcard is a brand new game with some really cool innovations on this genre, namely there being multiplayer and having zonal enemy positioning to contend with. It doesn't go full grid-based Final Fantasy tactics, but it uses these semicircular zones to determine the relative distance of different enemies to each character and which character they are preparing to attack. If you're a fan of this genre and want to see what it would be like to play Slay the Spire mixed with cooperative Diablo, then this is definitely worth a look. But I struggled with it a little bit in my single player run. Perhaps it's because it's designed to be played with multiple people, but I felt like a lot of the decisions about where to go next gave me too much information about what was coming up. So instead of the kind of mystery and surprise I got from unlocking things in Slay the Spire, it felt more like I was getting given lots of reading comprehension homework before I could even start the next level. Look, I already did a PhD, it made me allergic to books, and subsequently to games which look like books. Speaking of which, we get the same framing device as Roguebook, that this is a game happening in a book, and I'm personally getting a little bit tired of how many games involving cards feel the need to tenuously theme themselves around cardboard in some way. I'm not sure what it's meant to add beside making the animation easier and, unfortunately, encouraging me not to take the game's world particularly seriously. And sneak. I don't think you should use sneak and kiss neck together. That's a violation of consent, and the kissing of necks is something that both parties involved should consent to, which means that sneaking in conjunction with that card is inappropriate. Party house! Those of you who watched my recent video essay on the amazing strategy design of Avianos will know that I've been slowly working my way through the UFO 50 collection, and that's why I have to give an honourable mention here to Party House, which I still haven't completed a single scenario of despite playing for some hours. In Party House, we don't have spires to slay or books to rogue. Here, our deck of cards, if you can call it that, is actually a Rolodex filled with potential party guests. Each evening, we throw a new party and can invite as many guests as we have space. Unfortunately, some of our friends, whilst being quite popular, are also purple-haired troublemakers, and that means that drawing 3 of these naughty red crosses on the same night will see our party shut down by the popo, meaning we won't accrue any lovely yellow popularity points or cash which we would have otherwise used to invite more cool people or to inexplicably expand our house by one person sized unit. You can already see how there are some shared design ideas from Taverns of Tiefenthal here. Every turn I draw, and I can draw more if I've expanded the available space. But the trouble mechanic in Party House also makes this into a push your luck game like blackjack. There is a bust state that you can get yourself into, but because this is a deck builder, you can also make that state more or less likely to occur. We can invite a security guard to kick someone out, or a watchdog to make sure someone doesn't come in the first place, or a hippie to chill everyone out and reduce the current trouble factor, because that's how that works. Like a lot of games in the UFO 50 collection, this is surprisingly deep. Each scenario uses a different pool of guests, each with the end goal of bagging 4 appearances from one of the supernaturally themed star guests. This game really stuck out to me because it feels a lot closer to one of those more engine building focused card games like Dominion. I'm focused on generating resources in this game's economy, and some of the other cards are there to synergize in order to maximize that or to better mitigate the risk of the troublemakers. Because this isn't a deck builder attached to a battle game, I spend a much larger proportion of my time adding to and thinking about my deck. I'm not necessarily saying that this is deck building done right, but it still surprises me that this is the first video game I've played in nearly a decade where deck building is used in this way and not following the Slay the Spire model where the deck building is something that happens in between the gameplay. And what's even stranger is that this game isn't really using the iconography or language of cards and decks. It's all there mechanically, but the focus is on using this relatable theme from everyday life, and that leads to some funny emergent stories too. Oh no, the monkey can stay, but you have to go. Yes, you're both trouble, but the monkey is twice as cool as you, so he's worth the risk. We've got 2 leftover cards, so let's put these over in a discard because I've used them. I've played my turn. Imagine that we know what a turn looks like in this game. This is the great thing about using something like Tabletop Simulator, is you get to see things you couldn't do with real cards, like a card that is this shape on one side, and then when you flip it over, it's like a one-way mirror around the edge. That's really cool. This one says that I can steal my opponent's weapon, but I don't have an opponent at the moment, and they don't have a weapon. What I do have is all of these animated miniatures. Does a dragon have a weapon? It has some naturally occurring weapons, but I don't think I can steal any of those, so you're going to have to die. You've got a weapon. I don't really want a stick though. How about you? Assuming you're my opponent, I can steal your weapon, but it's attached to you, isn't it? What's going to have to happen is you just stay over here with me, right? Because I've stolen your weapon, and because I can't get it off you, you just have to stay here with that card. They told us that game item interoperability was a ridiculous idea and it wouldn't work, but look, it's working. It's all working. Personally, I love this genre, but that also means that I do hold new deck builder games to a very high level of scrutiny. I want to experience that perfect mixture of picking cards to build deliberately towards a strategy, but then occasionally ending up with some weird spanner in the works that I have to build around. I really like the combination of long-term strategy that comes with the deck building and the tactical decisions that come from drawing a hand and just having to deal with what's there at the moment. There you have it, the complete unabridged history of deck builders. I've talked about basically every deck builder game that's ever been made, and if there's any that you think I've left off this list, it's probably because you imagined or hallucinated one. On this channel, Indie Game Clinic, I put out 2 or 3 videos a month which are usually more focused on unknown up and coming games, so if you're working on the next big indie deck builder and you want me to take a look at it and give you some feedback, you can get in touch using indiegameclinic@gmail.com. If your game is interesting and I think other designers can learn from it, then it might be a good choice to appear on my Indies Under the Knife series. On the other hand, if you're just someone who loves thinking about and hearing about game design and game design principles, you can help support the growth and development of this channel by subscribing to my Patreon using some of the links in the description.